also the interaction between monetary policy, technology, and globalization. Obviously, both panels should provide plenty of time for questions and answers. And given the topics and the panelists assembled here today, we are certain to have rich and stimulating debates. And before I give the floor to President Lagarde for her welcome address, I take the opportunity to clarify our media policy. All speeches and panel sessions during the conference will be webcast live, and everything is therefore on the record and can obviously be reported upon. Video recordings, especially of the keynote speech during lunch, will be provided afterwards on the website, and anything which I have not mentioned here is therefore off the record when you have the side notes. And with that, can I please ask President Lagarde to the floor?
The one we should applaud today, actually, is Benoît. And yeah. And the reason you're all gathered here today is not because of the ECB, is not because of the fantastically well-selected topic for the conference, it's because of him. And because in the course of his life, he's managed to harness a huge amount of goodwill, of friendship, of support, and of respect and admiration that you all decided to come to beautiful Frankfurt. Thank you. I'm not going to speak for long, Benoît, and I'm certainly not going to steal your thunder. But when you joined the ECB, under the leadership of my extraordinary predecessor, President Draghi, dear Mario, we're so pleased that you're here today. The situation was not dramatic, it was tragic. You had to take measures that we simply have forgotten. And I think it was you the other day who mentioned the difference between Greece's spread at the time and now, and it's something like 300 plus basis points difference in that period of time. And, Sorry, 3,000, of course. See, I stand to be corrected, but only by Benoît. It only goes to say that I'm going to miss you a great deal. So there might be a few more mistakes along the way. Benoît is not around anymore, haha. You know, I'm not going to read this paper. I've known Benoît for a long, long time, so have many of you. Bercy, then me at the IMF, you at the ECB. And all along, I have admired you leadership in terms of thinking, in terms of exploring new concepts, in terms of adjusting to the situation. And you had an extremely powerful leader in the person of Mario Draghi. But when he pronounced those now famous words, there had to be some people in the back of the room who actually crunched numbers, looked at how the pipes worked and how it could be most efficient to actually deliver on the mission that he had tasked you with. And I know it was teamwork. Your modesty will actually say that. But I also know how much leadership you applied to the process. And it is only due today that it is recognized in the presence of all your friends and colleagues. Some might not have agreed with you at the time, and some might not have agreed with the measures that were taken, and some might still disagree today. But I think there's a general consensus that, thank goodness, it was done at the time. And that's in no small part due to you in terms of the implementation, which actually was never to take place, because OMT is there, but was never used, yet was validated by the courts. So if the lawyers are happy with it, we should all be happy. The second memory that I have of you is that of almost the foreign minister of President Draghi. I don't think that there's been one single G7, one single G20, one single Eurogroup, one single ECOFIN, one single of those many meetings that we had around the world to try to address the financial crisis that you did not attend. And the thing about Benoît, as you all know, is that it's not that he did not attend, but he always attended in full. So whenever the meetings Ollie will remember that, and a few others in the room. Whenever the meetings ended at 3 o'clock in the morning, many had left, including myself occasionally. Benoit was still there, checking on the wording, checking on making sure that the intentions that had been expressed by the leaders would actually be delivered. There are not many of those foreign affairs minister or ambassadors who actually do that. So your resilience, your determination, your standing in those instances was remarkable. The last thing I'd like to say about you is about you. Your modesty, your humility only rival your intellectual power and your capacity to lead other people. And those combinations are rare in people. Because not only are you intellectually powerful, and the many books that you've published together with friends here attest to that, but you're also capable of inspiring other people around you, of empowering people around you, of not only giving good speeches about diversity, but promoting diversity in your teams. And the fact that the panels, as you will see later today, are very diverse in their composition is really testament to what you really believe in, that every individual is worth what they can actually accomplish if they're given a chance. So for all that, thank you very much, Benoit. I will miss you, many of us will miss you, but as Christine just said, we'll see you around, because after all, Basel is not that far, and we all often have to go to Basel, so we'll see you again. Thank you, Benoit.
Well, good morning to all. It's a pleasure to be back here this morning to celebrate Benoit's contribution to the ECB over the last 8 years. The theme of this colloquium, Monetary Policy, the Challenges Ahead, leads our eyes not only to the past, fitting Benoit's personality and celebrating his insights, it asks questions about the many challenges that lie on the horizon. My remarks today are primarily in praise of and friendship for Benoit. But precisely because Benoit is a person of substance over form, it's not possible to praise him without being drawn into the substance of the policy to which he has devoted his mandate. Benoit's time as a board member, as Christine's just reminded us, was one of change and innovation in many areas. The issues facing monetary policy over his tenure, however, can be broadly divided into two questions. First, whether the central bank can control financing conditions in the economy. And second, crucially, whether those financing conditions impact on real behavior, investment, consumption, saving, in the way that central bank desires. But before we get into the first question, let me make absolutely clear that the primary subject central banks look at when making their decision is the real economy. Once this is absolutely clear, we can consider other issues, such as the relationship between the central bank and the market, which is the topic of the first panel today. How central banks and markets interact, and critically, who leads them, who leads whom, is an important topic. Benoit reflected on a great deal during his time as a board member. From a policy perspective, however, any framing of the issue that pits the central bank and the market against one another is not especially fruitful. Ultimately, the central bank must make the market work alongside it. Jeremy Stein, in previous work, used a particularly evocative image to convey this notion. He said that central banks recruit banks and other financial intermediaries to transmit their policy impulses to the broader economy. This is because many channels of monetary transmission operate through financial markets, and first among them is the bond market. Market prices reflect expectations of central bank policy and how its reaction function is understood. They transmit its policies into financing conditions for the real economy, and they reveal the degree of confidence in the effects of monetary policy on output and inflation. Market prices, in other words, are a mirror of the policy stance, a channel of transmission, and a barometer of central bank effectiveness. However intensively a central bank deploys its instruments, it can only succeed if it recruits the market to extend its reach. So the most important policy question is, what's the best way for central banks to ensure that the market is working with them to achieve their goals? Central banks first have to be clear, and here the key word is clarity, about their assessment of the economy. And second, to be prepared to deploy the necessary tools within their mandate so as to steer the economy in the direction that is most consistent with attaining its mandate. If these two conditions are met, then the market will follow and be a key ally, helping the central bank deliver its intended policy stance. Indeed, my view is that monetary policy is fundamentally guided by an assessment of the economy. And it is only when the central bank shares that assessment with the market and convinces the market that it's ready to do what is necessary within its mandate to achieve its objective, then the market will be recruited to its side. We saw this during the crisis. Before the crisis was generally thought that the capacity of monetary policy to steer financing conditions would diminish as interest rates approached zero. But major central banks showed this was not a foregone conclusion. By explaining why unconventional policies were needed given the state of the economy, and by showing their commitment to using them, they were able to continue easing financing conditions even as rates hit zero line, be it by breaking through the zero line and by using asset purchases to lower term premia further out in the yield curve. In the ECB's case, successive policy packages were able to lower the whole matrix of interest rates across the maturity spectrum and asset classes to levels that could spur the economy and inflation normalization. That process was so powerful that monetary policy became the main driver of the economic recovery since 2014. And once the market understood how and why these policies worked, it opened up another possibility, which is for a more transparent disclosure of the reaction function that reinforced the stabilization capacity of monetary policy. Forward guidance is an example of this. In the case of the ECB, it now means that the start of the rate lift-off, the end of net asset purchases, and the end reinvestments are all automatically revised by markets in line with the latest data releases. And then that in turn leads to rate expectations and term premia adjusting in the direction desired by policy. So this illustrates how, with the right tools and communication, markets can, quote, fight alongside the central bank, but with policy leading and prices following. That said, central to the effectiveness of this mechanism is confidence that the central bank is institutionally empowered to use all the instruments it needs to fulfill its mandate. Post-2008, the ECB faced an exceptionally complex environment where for some time the irrevocability of the euro was not taken for granted, where monetary policy was complicated by fiscal policies and sometimes financial sector policies acting pro-cyclically, and where the ability of the ECB to act to secure price stability was challenged in court. This meant that the ECB had to restore policy transmission, not only by adjusting the parameters of policy, but also by dismantling false conceptions about its willingness and capacity to act. This was also reinforced by the rulings of the European Court of Justice. And as Christine just said, when the lawyers are happy, we are home. So I'm confident that those exceptional circumstances are now consigned to the past. Throughout this period, Benoît contributed greatly to the success of ECB's actions, in particular as the board member in charge of markets. That gave him a key role in the design of the outright monetary transactions, OMT, and in the execution of the asset purchase program. But Benoît also helped turn financial markets into an ally in a more indirect but equally powerful way. He convinced through the strength of argument. Indeed, central bankers can influence markets, not just by expressing their views about the state of the economy, calibrating their tools, or defining their reaction functions. They can also do so by leading the debate in economic and policy circles about the tools that are needed in any specific circumstance and how they work to achieve their goals. That's why we make so many speeches. And Benoît himself, by the way, last night, Mark, he's here? No, he's not here, gave a different count. I was on a slightly lower number, 175 only, as a board member. So that was very important because he shed light on many critical issues for the ECB, and in doing so shaped public opinion and built confidence. A confidence that was crucial when we were introducing measures for which there was no prior precedent. Still, and now I come to the second question, if central banks are successful, even if they're successful in making the market work with them, how accommodative financing conditions can affect the real economy? There is ample evidence that easier financing conditions lead to higher consumption and investment. We've seen all of the main transmission channels at work in the euro area over the last 5 years. Intertemporal substitution through credit, wealth effects, and income effects. Importantly, and contrary to a common narrative, monetary policy exerts some of its strongest effects via those at the bottom of the income scale. These people are typically net debtors, and so experience a positive income effect from lower interest payments. They also benefit disproportionately from the employment gains created by the expansionary monetary policy. And since these households have a higher marginal propensity to consume than those higher up in the income scale, the subsequent effects on consumption are significant. But that being said, one can also envisage situations where the causality from easier financing conditions to stronger demand might become looser. One example is when there are high levels of macroeconomic uncertainty, which can affect private sector transmission, particularly via business investment. Another example is where there is institutional uncertainty, which can lead to precautionary savings as countries are forced to self-insure. President Lagarde recently talked about how insufficient risk sharing within the EMU can create a paradox of thrift in this regard. A third example is the question surrounding the reversal rate and how close policy rates are to a point where they might hamper monetary policy transmission and or trigger mass retrenchment from credit creation. Whether we are close to the reversal rate is an empirical question. But insofar as these various effects are plausible, they call for independent central bankers to reflect. They imply a need to think beyond their sole field of action and to understand interactions between policies. For example, if macroeconomic uncertainty is constraining the private sector transmission of monetary policy, the public sector transmission channel becomes more important as a counterweight. So monetary fiscal interactions have become more relevant. Likewise, if the slow pace of institutional deepening is producing precautionary saving, a commitment to move faster can raise confidence and provide a demand stimulus. And the ECB has made this point on and on and on. So monetary policy and the EMU reform become part of the same policy mix. In other words, one can conceive of situations where the classic interpretation of the Tinbergen principle, where single tools are assigned to single objectives, becomes less useful because it is in fact multiple policies working together that can best deliver those objectives. Independence and democratic accountability require central bankers to fulfill their mandates even when policy areas do not contribute enough. Of course, they should act carefully under uncertainty and be aware of the financial stability risks that their actions might entail. But one question that is rarely asked is whether these financial stability risks would be lower in the absence of the monetary policy that is required by their mandate. At the same time, central banks cannot compel other policy areas to act alongside them. Instead, they have to explain to others what is needed to deliver price stability most efficiently and to convince them of why it is necessary. And since this is in the service of price stability, it is not contrary to the principle of monetary dominance. It is rather its natural extension in new economic times. Monetary dominance means that alignment between policies must serve the central bank's objectives and never detract from them. And this brings me back to Benoit. Few have done so much to explain and so convincingly why other policy areas need to play their role in a well-functioning monetary union. Even in the last interview, you said that. He's explained the interactions between monetary policy and structural policies. He's set out how a euro area fiscal capacity could be constructed while avoiding moral hazard. And in his role in charge of international European relations, he's led debates on the institutional reform of EMU and its link to the transmission of monetary policy. I hope that in the future, when policy coordination becomes more salient, the world will continue to heed what Benoit has to say from his new position in Basel. So let me conclude by saying thank you, Benoit. Thank you for everything you did, and thank you in advance for everything you will continue to do. Thank you.
I would now like to invite the chair of the first panel session on the role of bond markets in the
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Mario, and thank you, Benoit. So it's a pleasure and it's an honor to be here for Benoit's farewell conference. And before we get into serious matters, I would like to share with you a few personal thoughts about Benoit. So Benoit is what we call in French a humanist. He combines the highest scientific formation with the widest appetite for literature. I'm sure most people could not recognize the authors that were on their name table yesterday. He speaks Japanese, he climbs mountains, he smokes cigars, he loves opera, he writes books. He will do another one with his speeches here. He collects art, but above all, Benoit is a truly faithful and generous friend, as you can all testify here. And I think on top of this, he has the unique quality of having always combined freedom and responsibility in his professional life. So Benoit, you're only in the middle of your career. And as we discussed many times, you've barely reached your productivity peak. Since, as you know, the 50s is the new 40s. And given what you have achieved in barely 20 years, I'm not sure we have enough imagination to picture what you will do over the next 21. Now, as you often say, there's no free lunch, or rather dinner. So we're here to talk about the role of the bond market in the conduct of monetary policy. As Mario just alluded, bond markets provide indicators of financial condition, inflation expectations, and perception of risks. And these indicators are based on the analysis of the current and future economic outlook, their understanding of central bank economic views and reaction function. These financial conditions, therefore, depend significantly on the quality of communication between central banks and markets. So now, communication has not always been prominent among central bankers, and I will read you a little extract from a discussion between Keynes and Harvey, who was deputy governor of the Bank of England, hi John, in 1929. So Keynes, is it a practice of the Bank of England never to explain what its policy is? Harvey, well, I think it has been our practice to leave our actions to explain our policy. Keynes, are the reasons for its policy? Harvey, oh, it's a dangerous thing to start giving reasons. Keynes, or to defend itself against criticism? Harvey, as regard criticism, I'm afraid, so the committee may not all agree. We do not admit here there is a need for defense. To defend ourselves is somewhat akin to a lady starting to defend her virtue. Now, modern central bankers have moved way beyond this and communicate through policy statements and press conferences and economic forecasts, official reports, speeches, interviews, testimonies before public bodies. You might argue this is too much. However, the better markets understand how the central bank will react to the state of the economy, to unforeseen events, the better they anticipate policy action. In an optimal world, conditions in financial markets should timely and gradually tighten or loosen as economic news suggests changes in the economic state of the world, anticipating the central bank reaction. And this is particularly relevant in the post-crisis unconventional monetary policy world we are living in today. So because it is Benoit, we have to quote a lot of academics, and I will start with one which is Gertson and Woodford in 2003, who have demonstrated that effective communication is especially powerful in a global environment of low nominal rates and reduced policy space, because it can reduce the size of central bank interventions required to achieve desired financial conditions. Effective communication may be also particularly important when there are a lot of risk accumulated in markets. In that case, central banks may wish to minimize volatility when financial markets adjust to changes in economic conditions and therefore monetary policy action. There are also reasons to worry about excess communication. And that has to do in a way with the personal nature of monetary policy and financial market dialogue. Now, as Jeremy here and Yunshin here expressed in previous occasion, the market is not a single person, and the central bank committee is not a single person either. But markets can only adjust in line with central bank expectations if they understand correctly the signals sent by the central bank persons. There also must be a certain degree of latitude so that both financial market and central banks can adjust to the state of the economy without triggering large movements of volatility that would destabilize financial conditions and in turn the real economy. So altogether, too much information, especially when there are different opinions coming from one committee, may result in conflicting signals about the policy path, the famous Blinder, second quote, 2007, cacophony of voices, and that may increase uncertainty for markets and private agents. But there is an additional concern about communication, which is that it goes both ways, and I'm sorry to quote you a second time, but as you said before, there is the talking part and there is the listening part. So that if central banks talk more to influence market prices, there may be an argument that they should perhaps listen less to signals emanating from the same markets. And I quote you, in an echo, otherwise the central banks can find themselves in an echo chamber of their own making, acting on signals that are echoes of their own pronouncement. And even more, monetary policy relies on and influence market signals, so the circularity between monetary policy and market reactions may amplify a bad signal, and this can, in turn, unduly constrain policy action. If the central bank fears that when it deviates from market expectation, it will create strong volatility. So perhaps this is what Benoit wanted to signal with his session today, if we can take any clue from one of his 180 or so speeches in Bourgogne in 2017, where he quoted Paul Samuelson, who famously compared the central banker who reads too much from movements in the bond market to a monkey who discovers his reflection in the mirror and thinks that by looking at the reactions of that monkey, including its surprises, he's getting new information. However, one could argue that central banks always have the opportunity to look at an extended set of signals way beyond the bond market. And this is the last point I will make, because you're here to listen to Hélène, Charles, and Jeremy. Obviously, the clearest forward guidance would be a fully transparent algorithm that relates interest rate to economic data. But to date, such a mechanical reaction function only exists in economic models, and policymakers have to use their judgment, manage their decision, and that's inherently uncertain. Benoit, you may be working on such an algorithm in your future life, but in the meantime, I think we have to leave Jeremy, Charles, and Hélène debate the dialogue between central banks and markets, and hopefully disentangle what is the reality of this dialogue from the mythological part Marvin Goodfriend analyzed. Thank you. And you start.
Okay, well, first, thanks very much, Laurence, and it's just a privilege to be a part of honoring Benoit for his extraordinary public service. And I just want to thank him personally for the example he set for how to combine the best economic thinking with a deep understanding of markets and institutions and really principled policymaking. It's been an honor to watch and to learn from our interaction. So thank you, Benoit. So what I thought I would do is touch on one particular aspect of the panel's topic, namely the consequences and potentially the dysfunctional consequences of central banks being overly attentive to how markets receive their words and actions. So I'm going to try and speak specifically to the monkey in the mirror issues that Laurence just flagged. So let's see, the slides got a little cut off here. But so when I first came to the Fed, I have to say one of the things that was most surprising to me was this. So of course I understood that the markets pay enormous attention, not only to the actions but to every word, to how the statement is being changed, to all that. I understood that. What I didn't fully appreciate was the other side of this monkey feedback loop, was just how attentive the Fed, and I think central banks in general, are to what the market is thinking about what they're thinking. And so one of the things that struck me as particularly odd about our practice, I don't know if it's exactly the same at the ECB, is at the beginning of every FOMC meeting, the first thing we would have is a report from the desk in New York where they've done a survey of market participants, and the market participants tell us what they think we're going to do. So, during the bond buying era, there would be a survey that says, what are the probability you attach to the likelihood that the Fed will taper asset purchases at this meeting? Market participants would say it's highly unlikely, 5% probability. And then you sometimes felt like QED, they've decided we're not going to taper at this meeting. Then obviously if we taper at this meeting, we'll have shocked the market, and that's and so, that's something that struck me as odd. And in the years since, have tried to think about it a little bit more formally, have done some modeling work. And if you think about it, there's sort of two key ingredients in thinking about this problem are, one, you have to believe that the Fed has some information about its own intentions, its own actions. That sort of just means that the market reacts to the Fed. And or I should say the central bank, excuse me. And second, that there is a concern, and this is where we get into kind of the difficult thing, that there is a concern on the part of the central bank with the market volatility response to its words and actions. And if I could leave you with one sort of overarching idea from this, it's that mix of ingredients gives rise to a time consistency problem. So everybody in this room is familiar with the idea of time consistency problems in central banking, typically around inflation. And we sort of understand the idea of pre-commitment or of culture in the sense of, you know that when you become a central banker, you're supposed to hate inflation, right? Because what we've learned from this time consistency problem is you actually get a better outcome in terms of both inflation and output, or inflation and unemployment, if you commit yourself or if you build a culture that is particularly worried about inflation. Okay? What I think is less appreciated is a somewhat analogous time consistency problem, which is even if there is some legitimate reason to care about the market, it can be important to build a culture around or a set of norms around not behaving as if you're too worried about the market response to your words and actions. So that's the basic idea. And the flip side of that is if you are too sensitive to the market, you can get a variety of sort of dysfunctional outcomes. So I'll try to mention a couple. One is this well-known idea of gradualism in monetary policy, where even when the world changes, when fundamentals change, the central bank often wants to move in very, very small steps. But there are other examples, one being sort of this being led by the market phenomenon that Laurence alluded to, where market sentiment shifts and basically, or market expectations about the central bank shift, and the central bank, in order not to disappoint the market, feels like it has to go along. Where there's some, and that's the thing I felt quite keenly myself, some loss of agency in terms of your policy because you're being led by the market. So here's just a dopey thing you can do with the transcripts. This is just a little exercise we did where we counted, very, very simple thing. We counted the number of times in the transcripts people alluded to financial markets, said words like bond market or bond market volatility, and then just divided by the total number of words in the transcript. And you can sort of see the pattern. Obviously, it goes up and down, not surprisingly at all. Around the financial crisis, people are talking about financial markets a lot. But even if you filter out these sort of ups and downs, there's a very strong time trend here that basically this fitted value, the red line, goes up by a factor of something like 5. So the idea that central bankers are not only concerned, but have become more concerned in recent years with markets seems to be there in a very, very crude cut at the data. As I said, it's a very well-known fact that the funds, that policy rates adjust relatively inertially to changes in what you might think are the sort of fundamental targets. Here's a picture of the funds rate during a hiking cycle. They went 17 times in the same direction. You sort of kind of knew where they were going, but they somehow wanted to get there slowly. We have a quote here from Alan Greenspan, which basically kind of captures, I think, the intuition. We don't want to create discontinuous movements in asset prices. But note the sort of conundrum here, or the paradox. It's just like companies that smooth their earnings. They think, if we have smooth earnings, we won't have a volatile stock price. But of course, the market comes to understand that you're smoothing your earnings. So then if you miss your earnings target by even a penny, it becomes a big deal. Same thing, the market understands that you're moving gradually. So then everything you do is freighted with significance. Even if you don't move at all, but you change the statement, that in itself becomes a thing. And so it's hard to make the volatility go away. And at the end of the day, what you're left with is very gradual adjustment, but probably not a whole lot less market volatility, just greater market sensitivity to a given small movement. And maybe, as in the case with this sort of the policy rate is just not really where you want to be, right? You've sort of smoothed. You haven't really accomplished anything, but you've ended up a little bit further than where you want to be. So again, that's just one example of something that can happen when you're too focused on markets. But there are others. We talk so much about data dependence, and at some level, it's like motherhood and apple pie. How can you not want to be data dependent? But I think sometimes in this sort of loop with the market, you can get a particular kind of data dependence, which seems a little odd and a little dysfunctional, which is an obsession with the most recent number. And again, everybody in this room has probably seen or felt some example of this, but the one that sort of left an impact on me is, we'd be kind of running up to a meeting, and there was kind of a default decision, maybe we'll taper at this meeting, or maybe we'll raise rates, but the market somehow gets it in its head that the central bank is very data dependent, and boy, the payroll number that comes out on the Friday before the meeting is a big deal, and the market's conjecture, in some sense, is if that payroll number is not good, where good means something like 200,000, they're going to step back and not do it at this meeting. Okay? Then you find yourself praying to the god of measurement error and say, boy, I hope we don't get a flaky number, because it's self-validating. I mean, we had one of these where I think we were about to taper. This is September of 2013, I think, and we're basically set to go, and the number comes out, and the number is not 200, maybe it was like 170 or something like that. And of course, and I know, and we all know that there's no meaningful difference between 170 and 200 in one number. But if the market thinks that's your rule, and now the market going into the meeting is thinking they're not going to do it, and the evidence is, and Goldman Sachs has produced this kind of research, very, very unusual for the Fed to make a tightening move that is not fully baked into market expectations at the time. So what do you get? The market's conjecture, in some sense, is validated. They hold fire when the number is a little disappointing. So one response to this is, I think one thing that's constructive, the problem here is if meetings are always kind of a jump ball, if it's always just hanging in the balance, that's when it's most freighted with informational content. So the problem, the sort of theory would tell you want to take some of the informational content out. So in some cases, you can't always do this, but in some cases, to the extent that it's possible to have a default presumption. So what I mean is, it's not hanging exactly in the balance, but sort of there's an expectation that as long as the data is broadly between, say, the 25th and the 75th percentile, this is what we're going to do. That makes it easier to implement the policy. So a particular example is, again, when the Fed first started thinking about tapering, it was just an enormous big deal, right? There was the taper tantrum. Every little signal was a big deal. Then we sort of happened our way into something which I think was maybe a little inadvertent, but was helpful, which is the assumption started to be that once we started to taper, that at every meeting afterwards, we were going to do $10 billion more. Well, of course, unless something dramatic happened, but there was a sort of a notion that for a broad set of outcomes, we would kind of do this $10 billion a meeting. Well, then when you do it, there's no information content, so it's easy to do. Similarly, sometimes in a hiking cycle, you can find yourself in a situation where you can create a default, which is as long as nothing too dramatic happens, right? And that's helpful. Whereas if you set each meeting up as this super data-dependent thing, you can get yourself, I think, a little bit trapped. And it's just something that comes out of this way of thinking that the underlying problem is this kind of market inference about your private information, and then what you want to do is, in some sense, take some information content out. Okay, I guess I should cut. Okay.
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, so let me just say the one sort of tension in this that is it's sort of very apparent that I'm sort of very aware of is, I'm a believer. I know a lot of other people in this room are believers that at some low frequency, we should pay attention to financial conditions. That is to say, if financial conditions are tighter this year than they were last year, we should have an easier policy setting. And at the same time, I guess I'm trying to say we should really try to create a culture and a set of norms where we don't worry too much about the short-run impact on markets. Now, you might say that those things are at least partially in contradiction with one another. And in a random walk world, after all, the long run is just the sum of a bunch of short runs. So how can you believe both of these things? There is some tension. I will say that tension is mitigated to the extent that the market impact of a policy announcement is somewhat transitory, and the recent evidence is somewhat consistent with that. So, makes it a little easier to say I'm not going to be overly concerned with market impact, because often the market impact of a Fed announcement tends to revert away in the sort of 6 to 9 months afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm sorry we had to cut you off
Sorry.
when you were about to give some insight on the taper tantrum, but we'll come back to this. And I think Charles is supposed to offer a little contradictory view to Jeremy.
All right. Well, it's a great privilege and a great pleasure to be here today to honor the work that Benoit has been doing here. Lots of people are claiming to have known him for a long time. I probably knew him for longer than most people. I knew him when he was a graduate student in Paris. And he was not just a good graduate student, he was an unusually good and unusual person. I don't know how many people know it, but he speaks and reads, or at that time he used to speak and read in Japanese. For a young graduate student in economics, it was unusual. And I also discovered one morning when he came to visit us in my home that he can draw beautifully well. He has a talent for that and probably a training. And of course, he was unusually thoughtful. So it's been a pleasure for me all over this year to follow his blossoming. And his blossoming was actually successive transformations. He went to work, of course, in the Treasury, where he held a different position, and each time I discovered somebody getting bigger and more thoughtful. And of course, when he came to the ECB, it was another new life for him, and he's done obviously very well. I've been wondering why has he been so successful in everything he's done. Well, of course, he's good and he's well trained. That we all know. But I think what is unusual is the degree to which he takes science seriously. He just reads everything, and he thinks very hard about it, and then he comes to his conclusion. And again, Mario mentioned it, the many speeches that he has been giving over the time. I've been addicted to these speeches, not just because he mentions everything that I haven't read, so I feel I have read them after he talks about it, but also each one of them has a little personal touch and a useful contribution and an idea that obviously I didn't have before, so very, very successful, and it's a pleasure. We were discussing about jokes about Benoit. Actually, it's very hard to remember jokes. He's full of humor and about lots of things, but he doesn't open himself up easily to humorous remarks. So I won't go into more private things. I just stay here. Now, on the topic of today, we have to be a little bit serious. Again, this is a topic, as Mario mentioned earlier, that Benoit has been thinking very hard and made some very interesting contribution. So I've been asked to discuss that, and I feel humbled. This is one of the many cases where the student is better than the teacher. So I'll try to do a little bit of provocation, following on many of the things that Jeremy has said. And you'll cut me off when I've reached 1/10 of my presentation. Now, okay, there is this hypothesis that monetary policy has been important. Of course, that's the provocation, because you don't come in this house and make this statement. That's certainly not what is the rule of the house. Now, still, there is this huge paradox that we all know, that how the central banks have solved the world after the crisis, and ever since, for the last 10 years, they seem to be unable to bring inflation to a very moderate level. And that was supposed to be the easiest thing, and at least I've been in this generation who thought the problem is not to raise price inflation, but to keep it from exploding. So why do we have that? And that's where I'll link up with the financial market. We had these low for long interest rates, and there are a number of discussions about this creating distortions. It was mentioned before that there is this hypothesis that there is a reversal rate, and the reversal rates may be creeping up over time. So it may be around the corner now. There is this view that QE doesn't work anymore because there is so much liquidity because of all these distortions. And there is this view, so low or negative interest rates, QE, and forward guidance were the big non-standard contributions of the last 10 years, and now there is this view, none of these things are helpful anymore. And then there is this view that forward guidance is just not anchoring anymore inflation expectations. So we have all these assumptions which are being discussed. And what I want to do is to link it with the financial markets a little bit. My perception, I'm surely wrong, is that financial markets like the current situation of QE and forward guidance and low interest rates. Low interest rates are not for banks maybe, but for financial markets are mostly good news. Low borrowing costs, great asset valuations, so more the value of funds under management is very high. QE, lots of liquidity to absorb and take care of, so it's good business. And forward guidance is great because it limits market uncertainty, which is what markets hate. So maybe in a way, what is trouble for central bank is mostly good news for financial market. That's sort of my provocation. Now there's the question is, it's maybe too good to give up, so do the financial markets hold the central banks captive? And in a way, Jeremy has already developed the argument saying, yes, sometimes talking when he was in a central banker, we may get scared of rowing against the tide of the market. Now, here this Jeremy has said, this is the part about expectations, so I'll save time and get a bit later by just saying there are a number of ways in which markets influence central banks. And therefore central banks, and there's also some Mario said, central banks will try to shape expectations. Now, expectations. What I think is amazing how markets get it totally wrong most of the time. Not all of the time, but most of the time. This is about the US, the Fed. You have the interest rates and you have expectations over time extracted from financial market prices. And not all the time, but very often, markets just get it awfully wrong. That's about the policy rates. Here about inflation, and that's a picture I stole from Benoit himself. This is inflationary expectations. So the previous one was interest rates. This is inflationary expectations in Europe. So you have the actual inflation rate, and in red and in green you have market expectations. Again, in presenting this figure, Benoit was right in saying, well, we at the ECB, we also get it wrong often, so it's not just blaming the market. But the point, and I don't want to blame anybody, the point I want to make here is that all these communication strategies trying to improve the perceptions of the markets, which in turns may be forcing the hand sometimes of central banks, and it's just amazing the amount of mistake that's in this built up in these expectations. And then if you buy the argument this is influencing the central bank, there is something to be worried about. This is another thing about market expectations about euro interest rates in the eurozone following the September decision. I don't know if the central bankers here have seen that. This is scary. The market expect that by next July, 58% of market perception is that the interest rate will be minus 0.7%. Will be lowered will be lowered to minus 0.7%. So there is this pressure, majority of markets expecting things. We know it's wrong, but then the central bank has to think about it. And the market is pretty insistent in its own expectations. So here I picked up the Financial Times just before the historical meeting of the ECB Governing Council in September 2009. And so this is an illustration of the kind of pressure that I perceive central bankers are on, and Jeremy sort of accepted that. ECB's Draghi faces up to supercharged market expectation, just a kind of warning. And then there's lots of interviews of financial market participants. They must be important enough to be quoted by the FT. So one says QE infinity is beyond is what the market wants. I think people have bought these bonds because they expect to be able to sell them to the central bank. So that's what I think the market wanted to, the statement about the market wanted to see. You could see a market tantrum once the significance of that sinks in. It's another one, but it's a warning. If you don't do what we want, you'll see a market tantrum. And then there is a clear risk that there could be disappointment, so they are a bit realistic. If there is no discussion or mention of the issue of limits, QE limits, the market will take that very negatively. So here is the warning, and then the poor guys meet, and they have to make a completely independent decision. So clearly, time. Okay, then if it's time, I just want to go to, well, I want to pick up one issue about the ECB, if I may. So under this pressure, what I was going to say is that under this pressure, of course, this affects communications, this occasionally affects decisions. I want to go back to one aspect of the ECB, just because there will be a strategy review. I want to mention something. The treaty says that the governing councils decide by voting. As far as I can understand, it never votes. So the idea is consensus and so on and so forth. And one reason for that is, of course, his fear of markets, this idea of cacophony. So if we start saying we don't disagree, I think there is something deeply wrong with that. Given that the markets are never happy enough and never convinced enough, I think there is some serious thinking to be done about having frank discussions, having votes, and even statements that don't disagree. I mean, essentially what Jeremy was saying, the more you give information to the market, the more the next tiny bit of information will be exploited, the signal extraction. There may be some room of giving more uncertainty to the markets, because that's the way the world is, and it may be helpful. Now, the last thing I wanted to say, I won't say it.
On top of this, I think we should give the first question afterwards to the market, because some of it is there. Hélène, please.
Thanks a lot. It's a great privilege to be here today. And it's been a great privilege to discuss economics with Benoit over the years. Benoit has had a lot of involvement with the academic community. And I know it's going to sound as very self-serving, but I do think it's a good thing. I benefited greatly from his insights, from his speeches, over short talks, about long discussions. Such as last summer when Benoit and I and a few other people in this room were lost for many hours in the woods around Jackson Hole and had the chance to talk about deep matters. And as the sun was going down, nobody panicked, and certainly not Benoit. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different perspective here on the topic. So my two friends here on the panel have talked a lot about the effect on market, on central bank behavior. And I'm going to look more at the central bank monetary policy effect on market risk aversion. And I will look at that mainly through the idea that central banks affect risk aversion, in particular through the effect they have on financial intermediation. So that's going to be my angle. And I will look at the international aspect mainly, because that's what I've been doing some research about. So if we look at the effect of a Fed tightening, this is well known now on global risk aversion in markets. So you see here 100 basis point tightening. This has the effect of appreciating the dollar, that's the first panel, decreasing risky asset prices around the world, that's the second panel, and increasing global risk aversion, that's the third panel. To give you an order of magnitude, this global factor decrease corresponds to roughly a 10 points decrease in broad stock market indices. So these are big effects. Now, if you look at very different measures of risk aversions, they tell broadly the same story. So if we look at the effect of a tightening directly on the VIX, this is the first panel. You see it goes up on impact. You see that these various other measures of risk aversions go up on impact, essentially, when there is monetary policy tightening. Now, of course, this interaction between monetary policy, liquidity, and risk aversion is a topic that has been of interest for a while. And as a matter of fact, the first speech that Benoit gave in 2012 was precisely about these issues. So I'm quoting here, the procyclicality of credit liquidity is documented via the strong interaction of private liquidity and the global risk appetite of financial institutions. Indeed, the global risk appetite is one of the main determinants of a multiplier that links level of overall liquidity to levels of official liquidity. There is a self-reinforcing interaction between risk appetite and liquidity. So that was 2012. So of course, then Benoit moved on to do these 174 other speeches on many different topics. I got stuck on these things for like the next 5 years or 6 years working on these issues. And so what are the effects that we can think about? What are the mechanisms linking liquidity and monetary policy to these risk aversion measures of the markets, and how do they work? So I think that two main channels here. The balance sheet effect, which is, for example, discussed by Andrew Crockett in 2001, simply about the fact that when the interest rate is low, asset valuations look good. So balance sheets, everything, all the balance sheets look good. And so in turn, this stimulates more liquidity creation, more credit creation, and that increase valuations further. And that's a kind of reinforcing effect on financial markets here. I think there's also another effect, which is, so the balance sheet effect can be maybe thought about more like an intensive margin effect. There's another effect, which is a composition effect in the financial sector. More risk-taking intermediaries actually may take more or less prominence over time, depending on macroeconomic conditions, on regulatory conditions, depending in particular also on the level of interest rate. And by being the marginal prices of assets in various markets, they are the ones who can shape the time variation in global risk aversion. So there's a composition effect there, which I think is important. That means that in both cases, whether you think of it as the balance sheet effect or the composition effect, actually the fact that asset pricing is to a large extent, I think, due to financial intermediation, that means that asset prices are going to be very influenced by the characteristics of intermediaries which are prominent in the market, whether they are insurance or asset managers, or whether they are banks, it's going to matter, whether their value at risk constraints is very tightened or not, regulatory issues, that's going to matter. And on this set of financial intermediary asset pricing ideas, there's very interesting new work done by Ralph Kojan and Moto Yogo, for example, where they analyze very granular data to give us some insight about the effect of these different financial intermediaries on asset pricing. Now, how does that play out? Well, for example, in the past, if we look back at these years between 2003 and 2007, so there's a case to be made that risk aversion was very much shaped by the rise and fall of global banks. Here you see the influence of banking flows. This is the dark blue in cross-border flow. You see that there is a lot of volatility coming from these flows, and that global banks were really becoming important up to the crisis. Now, if they are relatively risk takers, that's going to shape risk aversion. The market is going to be less risk averse during those years. And this is, I think, probably this contributed to the buildup of risk in the global economy. These days, if asset managers are becoming more important, then it's going to be more important to study the institutional constraints of asset managers. Now, within banks, I'm just going to show you here a little, it's almost like a cartoon. I'm going to show you, so you see on the vertical axis, you have leverage of banks. This is taken from the Bankscope data, so this is all monetary and financial institutions. On the horizontal axis, you have asset quantiles. So if you go to the right, these are the big banks, okay? And to the left, these are the smaller ones. And this is going to be year by year, so the distribution of leverage by asset quantiles, each point is about 30 banks. So you see, bigger banks tend to be more leverage. That's the first information of this thing. Yes, it's pretty, but what is interesting is the time variation. So wait, Benoit, it's the time variation. So look at it. So this is 2003, 2004. This is the same scale on the vertical axis, 2005, 2006. So you see this skewness going up on the right tail, right? So you see the increase in market share in a way of what I would say the most risk-taking intermediary. So this is the time variation in this, which I think can be connected to the fact that when there is a boom, the more risk-taking players tend to actually increase their market share, and then they are going to price assets more, and this is the connection with global risk aversion. After the crisis, I'm going to show you just 2 years, we tend to go down, and this is due to the conditions, but also this is due to re-regulation, right? So, okay. Now, how does that, again, play out in a more broad setting? So if we think about the transmission of US monetary policy to the global economy, so I extracted here a few panels from the VAR, but I would like you to focus on these two ones. Again, it's a Fed tightening. and look at the effect of a Fed tightening on world financial conditions or the global factor in asset prices. Very strong, okay? So the transmission through financial markets of a Fed seems to be pretty strong. You see that the second panel, which I haven't underlined, is the world trade. There is an effect on world trade as well. But we are going to compare that with the People's Bank of China international monetary policy transmission, which is some ongoing work I'm looking at right now. And there, what is interesting is that if you have a tightening of the People's Bank of China, the world financial conditions of the global factor, certainly on impact, they don't move. Okay, so it's not a transmission via financial markets, it looks like. Okay, everything, you know, it's work that I'm currently doing. So, but that's what we see. But however, where the People's Bank of China seems to have a big impact is the world trade, right, and the world production. So it's more the real transmission side here. So this means there is this heterogeneity in international transmission channels of monetary policy. From the Fed, it looks like we look more at the global financial cycle, but also some effects on the trade cycle. From the People's Bank of China, it looks much more on the real side and on the trade side. Now, this is important because these are very different types of spillovers, right? So on the one side, you have spillovers through asset pricing, spreads, and therefore this has to do then with possibly with financial stability issues, etc. On the other side, you have terms of trade, commodity prices. This also will lead to wealth transfers, which can be very important, and to disruption in pattern of capital flows as well, that may play out later. But on impact, the financial variables are moving mostly, it seems, because of the Fed. So to conclude, because I'm at the end, I think, of course, the next step, which is going to be fascinating, is to study the style of the ECB in terms of international transmission. So to some extent, the euro is a little bit in between the Fed and the People's Bank of China, in the sense that euro area capital markets are still underdeveloped compared to the US one. The international role of the euro is still limited compared to the dollar. However, the EU is a trading power, a big one. Euro invoicing is a little bit less important than dollar invoicing. So it will be very interesting to see how it plays out in these various types of potential spillovers from the ECB. So one can study this using similar methodologies, which I'm hoping many people will try to do that, and I will certainly try as well. But I would like to end by citing Benoit, again in a recent speech at the Paris School of Economics, where he said, first, uncertainty is a pervasive feature of our profession. Second, perhaps the defining challenge for our profession is that our understanding of the economy is never settled. And third, there are no settled answers to applied questions. So because of that, I'm not going to conclude anything.
Thanks, Hélène, and thanks for being so respectful of time. This is a perfect transition with what I was thinking about Charles' presentation. Isn't it that just we economists always get it wrong? I think that was a perfect demonstration. I have a lot of questions, but I think it would be better if we get somebody from financial markets to react to what we've been saying. They usually are not so shy. If I may. Okay, Jean.
I'm very shy.
That's a lie.
It really isn't. Just a couple of comments. I mean, I think there we are. Firstly, I really welcome Jeremy Stein's remarks. I mean, I think it's from someone who has watched, interacted, transacted in markets for 25 years, starting in 1994 when one of the first big Fed shocks hit the market, I think the markets have become overly dependent on central bank communication. Now, I feel like, markets have been led to the trough, but there is a sense of too much certainty. Central banks wanting so much certainty that it kind of reinforces market imbalances. So I would probably kind of push back against Charles's let's say I would add a nuance to Charles's comments, which is the market does get it wrong very often, but I think that's partly because we're trying to follow central bank communication so closely. Now, that's not necessarily a criticism of central bank communication. It's just the point that to the extent that the central banks have focused so intensively on making communication clearer, that's coincided with what one might call the fall of theory, and the increasing disagreement around different aspects of monetary policy and economic theory. So think about the discussion about stock versus flow of QE. Very active discussion in markets and central banks over which matters more. Markets, I would say, tend to focus more on the flow. Many central banks focus more on the stock. Same on the reversal rate. Some would not distinguish between the reversal rate and negative interest rate policy more generally. So the point is, when you have that disconnect between what people agree on from a theoretical perspective and central bank efforts to try to be as clear as possible about the communication, ironically, it actually creates, it can create more misunderstanding. The other point I would note is that turning points, I think, are very risky. The point about short-term tightening in financial conditions and whether or not central banks should look through those, I would generally say they should, and it's not necessarily that harmful. But again, it's part of that question of cost-benefit trade-off in terms of you may end up with a much faster than desirable mean reversion or overcorrection of imbalances that have built up over the cycle. And I think that then feeds back to a point which is not fully appreciated in markets, that policy is not only kind of adding or reducing accommodation, but it's increasing or reducing volatility. And so those turning points where you've gone through a cycle of suppressing volatility, often by design, it can be very tricky when you hit a turning point. And that's where I think the addition of additional tools to the monetary policy toolkit, all the macroprudential tools, can hopefully make that transition a little bit easier and make it easier for central banks to not be so paranoid about tightening in financial conditions that comes from unexpected policy moves.
Thanks. I think.
Thank you.
Shall we get 2 or 3 questions and then you can answer? It's not because we've been praising Benoit's intellectual capacity that nobody can raise a hand for a question.
Olivier.
Ah.
Good. I was struck by Jeremy's remark that if you move in small steps, then the reaction of the market is going to be bigger, and there seems to be an invariance theorem there. The implication is, or the question is, well, if this is right, is the inertial degree, the degree of inertia of the rule that the Fed, for example, seems to be following, the right one? Should it not move much faster? I've always been puzzled as to why the adjustment was so slow, but your argument suggests that it is indeed too slow. Would you agree with that or not?
Pierre?
Pierre Winch. I'd like to come back to what Charles said, because I guess there is a lot of focus on uncertainty which comes from the communication of central banks. But I guess there is also at the same time more and more uncertainty about the efficacy of policies. So on the split between uncertainty from one side, which is communication, and uncertainty from the impact of policy, my guess would be there is more of the second part or kind. And what does it imply for communication?
Yeah.
I have a question for Jeremy. As central banks have tended over the last 10 years to communicate aggressively on forward guidance, but in reality and real world is more volatile than their own communication, meaning the data depending, in reality, you keep on having events. They have a narrative, which is very smooth. So I was interested to see how markets keep on forecasting. It's always a smooth line, always upward sloping, like a hill. In reality, it's like a cliff edge, up and down. So do you believe that actually central banks, by keep on having a very smooth narrative as if they could see in the future, which they don't because nobody can, in reality are creating more instability? Because if you suppress a real volatility, then you get shock.
Okay, I think that we'll move to answer. I think we're missing one question, which is we're talking about financial condition and the communication, but we're not talking about the channel of transmission between those financial conditions and the real economy, and to what extent the ECB actually has managed to impulse the real economy. And I think, Hélène, you went through the mechanism of transmission, so perhaps you could give us the sense of how successful or how impaired or why are we not seeing this financial condition being transmitted to the real economy, and has it got to do with this feedback loop between the market and the central banks? Who wants to start? Perhaps we should start with Charles.
Okay, I'll pick up on what you just said, because I can add the little thing I didn't have the time to say. In the discussion of why monetary policy seem, and that's also Pierre's question, to have such a hard time to affect inflation. There have been discussions over for the last 10 years, and hypothesis after hypothesis has been tried and then proven wrong, the Phillips curve disappearance and all of that. More recently, my understanding of the discussion is about inflationary expectations, how sluggish they are, how unanchored they are. And there is a lot of very interesting work by Gorodichenko and Quebion and others, where they look at expectations, inflationary expectations in markets and in the non-market private economy. And what they find is that, well, you've seen how wrong the markets are occasionally, and the private sector is completely wrong about the level of inflation, but the private sector is pretty good at forecasting the direction, up or down. And I think there is a deep implication is that it's the private sector, non-financial private sector, that set prices. And they are amenable to absorbing information from central banks or any information, but they don't get it because central banks talk a lot to financial markets in a jargon that most non-financial people can't understand. And there is a strong point, I think, to be made, and that's where I wanted to end up, for central banks to talk to the private sector, to employees, employers, who set, at the end of the day, set wages and prices and communicate what the central bank sees coming and is trying to achieve. So that's sort of an important aspect. And on Pierre's question, yes, if there is doubts about effectiveness of policy, then that's also something that central banks should address more openly than I think is currently the case.
Thanks. You want to follow up?
Yeah, I just want to add on this very interesting work that indeed Koibion and Gorodichenko have been doing with expectations and survey of expectations of people, households and companies. So this is very different from market expectations. And indeed what is, I mean, you could even say almost shocking, is that in their data at least, a lot of people really do not understand at all even the objective function of a central bank. That is to say, a lot of people do not know where is the target and do not know what the target is. And a lot of people would really think that there are inflation rates which are 10%, whatever. There's a huge distribution of people making very large errors on basic facts. Okay? So if we think that's going to matter for the transmission channel, I mean, we can discuss it because indeed, financial intermediation, the experts, etc., are forming different types of expectations. But that's a key issue, and that means there is a failure of central bank communication. And there's also lab experiments showing that expectations to affect the way people form expectation, one thing to to emphasize is to do repeated simple messages with the basic facts. So that could be something to explore more. I mean, I don't know, but that's clearly an issue as things stand. And now, on the other point, that or you want me to delay and to let Jeremy answer because it's more on this topic of.
Yeah, perhaps let's do that. Also, I think what would be nice as a conclusion, because we need to conclude shortly, is if each of you had one sentence for the monetary policy review where you think that the ECB should look into. So that leaves you time to think, and Jeremy can start with the difficult questions.
Okay, on Olivier's question about whether the extent of gradualism is excessive, in this kind of a model, yes. Okay, because basically the market is unwinding, and so the attempts at sort of pacifying the market are unsuccessful in equilibrium, and you've just sort of distorted the rate. Now, two caveats to that in the real world. One is you have to believe something about the transmission mechanism. In other words, if you have a sort of classical view and all that matters for transmission is the long rate is kind of going to be what it's going to be no matter what, and you haven't had much of an effect. If you think that the short rate is an important part of the direct transmission mechanism because, say, you believe in a lending channel, then you have moved the short rate away from where it would otherwise ideally be, and then you have compromised something. So that's one caveat. You have to believe that. The other is, of course, there are good reasons for some degree of gradualism, and this is an idea that goes back to Brainard and others, when you're sort of uncertain about it's a sort of instrument uncertainty idea. When you're uncertain about how much a funds rate move is going to do, you might want to kind of tap rather than go. So you don't want to take this too much and to say just because we see some degree of inertia and it's not a random walk, that's evidence of something wrong. But I think you might this would lead you to at least be a little bit skeptical about sort of this very, very excessive, sort of extreme gradualism that we see. On the other point about narratives, I think this is incredibly important. I don't know how to quite formalize it, but data, everybody says data dependence, we're going to be data dependent. It's a meaningless statement in and of itself because there's an infinity of data. And so unless you sort of are willing to sort of pony up a model that tells you which data is important, it doesn't really have much content. And then this is where I think narratives are very important, because I think the narratives or the paradigms or whatever are prone to shift a little bit abruptly. And when they shift abruptly, all of a sudden data that was always there in plain view becomes all of a sudden relevant. So, there was a period, I can't remember if it was 2015 or 2016, there was some bad news out of China, and the Fed was kind of on hold, and all of a sudden, this low R star narrative kind of comes to the fore. Well, whatever R star was, it hadn't changed very much in recent months. It's a very, very slow-moving variable, but it comes to the fore, and that becomes the dominant narrative. And so I think that's a very interesting, these things don't move. The narratives don't move continuously, so the data that all of a sudden you're drawn to looking at, even though the underlying data may be smooth, if you're all of a sudden shifting your attention from one to the other, that's the sort of interesting thing. I think that has not been really kind of analyzed, but I think that's a really sort of centrally important part.
Your 1 cent tip for the ECB review? Hélène.
Since my talk was on financial intermediation and transmission, focus on how to make transmission better.
Charles?
Well, something about communication. I mean, there should be a review of communication, and in my view, there should be some thinking about focusing on talking to the plain people who don't understand monetary policy, but set prices. But more importantly, I think there should be a recognition that the control of inflation is not precise, cannot be precise, and having a target of close to but below 2% seems to be a bit much more precise that way can be achieved, and it creates unneeded, undeserved difficulties.
So I was going to actually echo Charles's point here, and I've been thinking about it maybe a little bit more in the context of the Fed's communication review, but I don't like, and I'm uncomfortable with 2.0 as a thing, and then we're going to have to hit 2.0, and if 1.7 we're failing. I would sort of prefer some kind of zone of indifference so that, within that zone you can, I think first of all it makes for better communication, and second, you don't, force yourself to mechanically do things that are not appropriate for the circumstances of the moment. So for example, if you're at 1.7 inflation and financial markets are sort of in a normal state and you want to put more the pedal to the metal to try to get to 2, maybe that makes sense. If there's sort of quite a bit of financial market instability and you're going to add more fuel to the fire, really just to get from 1.7 to 2, I think you want to be able to condition on those circumstances and not set yourself this sort of overly precise target. And I think that applies probably to the ECB as well.
So thank you. I will not make conclusion. They've done it. And let me thank all the panelists for great insights on communication.
Benoit for offering me the opportunity to chair this great panel. I'm very honored and especially touched. Benoit is a very good old friend, very faithful actually. And I'm lucky enough to be one of the co-authors of Benoit, and I can tell you that it's really fun. I think, so I'm not going to add to the list given by previous speakers. Maybe Christine, Laurence, and Charles have forgotten some of the features. I think Benoit is also fond of cross-country skiing, of rock climbing, and overall he enjoys wild nature in general, and he has the ability, the rare ability to admire the nature at any time, and especially in the middle of a Greek crisis. And I think this is maybe one of the clues, this ability to admire the nature at the middle of a big storm. I think on the top of his analytical skills, this is very important to understand his success. So I'm especially delighted to chair this second panel on monetary policy, technology, and globalization, because I think these three elements, monetary policy, technology, and globalization, are the keywords of Benoit that will best define his footprint at the ECB over his 8 years term. For a central banker, of course, monetary policy is the equivalent of basso continuo for Baroque musician. But technology, globalization rather pertain to the repertoire of contemporaneous music, with new scales, new sounds, new instruments, and a batch of dissonances. So Benoit is not the conductor of this music, so please do not blame him. He's just someone trying very hard to tune the instruments and sometimes to deal with broken strings. So this is really essential. So everybody that knows about symphonic orchestras knows that this is really key. Furthermore, Benoit's curiosity and culture make him able to hear each of the voices in this cacophony. So he's definitely open to new technologies and new ideas. So like Hélène, I came back to the first speech in February 2012. Actually, this was a joint workshop of the ECB with, guess whom? The Bank of International Settlements. Already, here in Frankfurt, about global liquidity and risk appetite, a reinterpretation of the recent crisis. So at that time, Benoit was quite shy. There were only 7 footnotes in this speech. So over the 8-year term, he delivered many speeches. This has been repeated. My own count is an average of 2 per month. About what we are going to discuss in this panel, international capital flows, global liquidity, international aspects of monetary policies, payment systems, and more recently, digital currencies. So 3 months ago, he gave a very insightful speech in Luxembourg. This was a joint conference of the Central Bank of Luxembourg with Toulouse School of Economics. And the speech was on digital challenges to the international monetary and financial system. And so the keywords were all together. The 3 keywords were all together. So a good introduction for this panel, actually. And here there were 45 footnotes. So this is more in line with his standard. So you probably know that Benoit is extremely popular in academia because he's the one that makes sense of the research produced. And also because he's very helpful, actually. When a student walks into my office asking for ideas or references, I can always rely on a speech by Benoit and for the analytical content and also for the footnotes. Not to mention, of course, his excellent books. So now I'm going to turn to this distinguished panel. We have 3 top researchers and top policy advisors. I have asked them to tell us what, in their views, are the main recent transformations in the area of technology, globalization, that are bringing major challenges for monetary policies. We'll start with Christine, who is going to discuss the new landscape of international capital flows and its implications for the resilience of the system and for monetary policies. So I'm not going to present each of the panelists. Of course, you know them. Just to mention something about each of them. So I just saw that she was named honorary commander in the Order of the British Empire by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II for services to the British economic policy. So more specifically, she's a former external member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. I'm very much impressed by this award. So thanks, Christine, for being with us today. You have 10 minutes, nevertheless.
Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here to celebrate Benoit's contributions to the ECB and the policy world more broadly. So as background for today, I did what it sounds like many of us did, which was Google Benoit's speeches. I was going to just say there's way too many to read. I didn't have the staff that Mark Carney or Mario Draghi has to actually count them. It's just a lot. But what I did, so then what I decided to do was narrow it down and focus on just the speeches you've given that had these 3 key words in the title. That was still too many speeches to print out and read. I even felt badly printing them out, under the pretense I might read them. We all do that, saying that sort of counts just to print them out, even if you don't have time to look at them. But given the ECB's newfound attention to the environment, I felt badly doing that. So instead, what I did is I'm going to focus my comments on your speeches that include those 3 words that you've given in the last 3 years, which is still a very long number of speeches, which is a testament to what so many of us have appreciated about you. You are prolific in choosing important topics, going beyond just the economic conjecture of the day, but really digging into important issues, pushing our thinking, summarizing the literature, summarizing the complicated academic literature in an easy to access way, and then pushing us to think about what we don't know, what we can learn, what we need to learn and think about more. And what has particularly impressed me reading through some of these speeches that I'll highlight today is how you were willing to question the conventional wisdom a number of times, and even question your own wisdom that you said earlier in speeches you wrote a year before earlier. There's a number of times reading your speeches, you see your thinking evolve as more data comes to light, more evidence. That's a hard thing for people to do. It's very hard for academics to do, but particularly hard for policymakers, where everything you say is scrutinized and recorded. So for you to reassess and update your thinking over time as more research came out, as more data came out, is quite impressive. So I'm going to try to do a bit of the same, and I'm going to focus on 3 topics which you talked about in your speeches over the last few years: capital flow volumes, capital flow volatility, and the relationship between capital flows, monetary policy, and exchange rates. And since I do not have as much time as you usually take in your speeches, I'm just going to focus on one angle of that, which is how all of these, what changes have occurred in these 3 areas and what that means for the resilience of the global financial system. So let me get right in there. Capital flow volumes. So here's a couple speeches, articles you've written on this. You were very early, might even say an early adopter, an important shift that happened in thinking about capital flows, a shift which several people in this room contributed to, and that was focusing not just on net capital flows, yes, Philip Lane, Helene Ray, to name a couple, but focusing not just on net capital flows or current account balances, but gross flows. As you highlighted early on, if you are worried about vulnerabilities, even countries with fairly balanced net capital flows or current account balances could still be highly vulnerable to liquidity shocks if they have large gross capital flows, inflows and outflows. So this is a graph which is very similar to the one Helene just showed us, gross capital inflows. This is for a sample of about 50 emerging markets in developing countries. It shows the well-known contraction in gross capital flows during the crisis, how capital flows have come back to some extent but are much more muted over the last decade or so. And if you look at the breakdown of why this has occurred, capital flows are more muted primarily because of a sharp contraction in global banking flows. So why has this happened? What has changed since the crisis? There's been quite a bit of academic research which has found some evidence for a variety of reasons why global banking flows have contracted. Some reasons are related to the crisis, after effects of the crisis. Some are related to policy changes adopted in response to the crisis. But one factor that comes through again and again, and there's very sound research now showing, is that a major reason for the contraction in global capital flows is regulatory changes. Tighter prudential regulations, tighter macroprudential regulations on banks have meant that banks have, holding everything else constant, contracted domestic lending and contracted international lending, particularly cross-border lending by banks. So that's fairly straightforward. It shows regulations are working in one sense, one of their intended goals. This is probably good for the resilience of the global financial system. Banks at the core of the system are safer, sounder, better capitalized. But where I think the more interesting work is, and where Benoit recently did a very nice article, was on the spillovers and the unintended consequences of this, what he called the known unknowns of financial regulations. And let me just give you one example, one which I believe Hyun will probably talk about more in a few minutes, in an example which comes from some research I've done with people at the Bank of Canada and Bank of England. One of these unintended consequences is related to macroprudential FX regulations. So this is one of these regulations which has become increasingly used around the world, basically a set of different measures which can be taken to reduce banks' exposure to FX, reduce banks' exposure to currency movements. These measures have been used more widely. They have meaningfully reduced banks' cross-border borrowing and lending in foreign currency, particularly in dollars. That's been an important factor contributing to this contraction in bank cross-border lending and borrowing. But one of the unintended consequences is that as companies have found it harder to access cheap FX loans from banks, companies are starting to increase more FX debt directly to markets. So on one hand, this is a good thing. Banks are less exposed to FX risk. We show in our work that banks' stock movements are now less correlated with exchange rate movements. So again, banks at the core of the financial system, sounder, safer, less exposed to foreign currency risks. But some of that risks have now shifted to the shadow financial system. More FX risk is held by mutual funds, hedge funds, pension funds, insurance companies, and other players. Some of them may be able to handle that risk. Some may be less well able to handle that risk than banks. And whether they can handle that risk or not, or understand what risk they've taken on, they are outside the regulatory perimeter. So regulators will have less of an idea of where those risks are accumulating and building up. So that's just one example of these unintended consequences which Benoit has talked about and which are very important as we think about the resilience of the system going forward. So second area where Benoit has made important contributions is on the volatility of capital flows. He has this great phrase he's talked about where he assesses financial globalization based on the 3 E's. If a globalization is efficient, enduring, and equitable. And in particular, he's focused quite a bit on whether capital flows have become more enduring, i.e. less volatile. So one might think, building on the comments that I just made, as global bank flows have contracted, and combine that with the fact that global bank flows tend to be the more volatile type of capital flow, this would mean that global capital flows, one would think, would be less volatile, possibly more enduring, as Benoit hoped for. Maybe his replacement would no longer need to worry about capital flows fueling bubbles and painful reversals. So to assess if this change has happened in the global financial system since the crisis, I'm now going to show you some results from some work I've done with Frank Warnock, where what we do is we measure what we call capital flow waves, or extreme capital flow movements, where we look at when there's sudden increases or decreases in capital flows coming into or out of different countries. And then what we do is we graph the incidence of countries, about 50 advanced economies and emerging markets, that have seen a sudden surge of capital coming in from foreigners on the left, or the share of countries that have seen a sudden stop of capital flows coming in from abroad on the right. And what you see is since the crisis, it looks like these capital flow waves, these extreme periods of capital flow movements, have become more muted since the crisis. Now that could be good news, and this could be relate to the fact that banking flows, again, have been reduced around the world. Those tended to be more volatile, and that means that we may see more volatility in global capital flows going forward. But much of this contraction in global banking flows has occurred in advanced economies. So a secondary question is, do you see the same pattern for emerging markets? Emerging markets are the countries that are most vocal about concerns about sharp changes in capital flows, and also the countries less able to handle some of these sharp movements. So now I'm going to show you the same graphs for just emerging markets. So what you see is the incidence of these sharp capital flow episodes in emerging markets are somewhat more muted, at least in terms of periods of large capital inflows coming from abroad on the left. But it's not so clear that these sharp episodes have faded, especially in terms of sudden stops. So this is more mixed evidence on the resilience of the global financial system since the crisis. At least for advanced economies, these capital flow waves seem to be more muted. Reduction in banking flows seems to be making capital flows more enduring, but the benefits for emerging markets have been more moderate. Now, another related factor, which Benoit has talked about quite a bit and which Helene also covered, is what's driving some of these changes. How does this relate to risk and changes in the global financial cycle? So there's a lot of research, Helene summarized some of it, in the work she's been doing in this area, on how these movements in capital flows, the global financial cycle, tends to be correlated with changes in a variety of risk measures, also correlated with changes in monetary policy, global liquidity, bank leverage, something which Hayun has worked on extensively. Now, what happens as global banking flows have contracted? Has this been mitigated, this relationship? Now, this is, I think, an important area for future work. We don't quite know, but there's starting to be some evidence that at least the correlations between risk measures and capital flow movements seems to have been dampened. It's still there, but quite a bit weaker. So if this continues, again, I think it's too early in the cycle to know for sure, but this could suggest more resilience in the global financial system. Again, back to tighter regulations, reducing global bank flows, and thereby reducing the sensitivity of some of these capital flows to ups and downs in the global financial cycle and risk. So it could mean the cycle is more dampened, but again, too soon to say for sure.
I'm afraid we won't have time for the third.
Okay. That I was going to talk about the interesting area that Benoit has worked on how monetary policy affects capital flows in the exchange rate, and where he pushed our thinking in terms of if asset purchases and unconventional policies have different effects on capital flows in the exchange rates. I will skip that in the interest of the time and just conclude with one area where I think we'd be remiss to not mention Benoit's contributions, and we haven't heard much about it yet. And that is that even though I focused on his contributions to economics, and most of us have, given the nature of this conference, the other area where I think he has made important contributions is not being afraid to bring in some political concerns. For example, one of his earlier works talked about the currency war criticism of monetary policy. And he was ahead of his time in bringing some of these issues to the forefront. I'm sure many of you remember Sintra, this summer when Mario Draghi talked about the need potentially for more expansionary monetary policy, which unleashed a torrent of tweets from the US president. And then soon afterwards at Jackson Hole, as Jay Powell was getting ready to go up, it was somewhat disconcerting that the main topic of conversation didn't seem to be whether he would suggest the Fed would lower 25 or 50 basis points, but the main conversation seemed to be how long it would take before President Trump tweeted in response to Powell's comments. And we were not to be disappointed. The tweets came soon afterwards. So it's fun to poke fun at this, but these experiences do highlight the importance of Benoit's approach to policymaking. Even when he tackled these types of very sensitive topics, he always relied heavily on evidence and research to justify his arguments. This is a model for a central banker, a model which is becoming more important as central bankers are subject to increasing political pressure, including to soften some of these reforms I just talked about that have strengthened the resilience of the global financial system. Whether political pressure affects the decisions of central bankers or not, it does put more onus on all of us to justify their decisions with evidence, so not to be perceived as making decisions based on politics instead of economics. And there, Benoit provide an excellent model we should all aspire to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine, and sorry for putting pressure on you, but we have to speed up the panel. But I think we will come back to your issues because Yoon is just going to continue with the impact of the dollar on these flows, inflows and outflows, so it's perfect timing. So please, Yoon, where you are going. So as I said, I'm not going to present him. He has a very brilliant career, but the important point today is to know is that he's going to be the next lucky colleague of Benoit.
Well, it's a great privilege to be here. This event is, in some respects, a retrospective, but for the BIS, we're very much looking forward to welcoming Benoit to Basel. Now, to the extent that the BIS is serving the whole central banking community, you will not lose him. And in fact, as we open this new chapter in financial developments that are really putting the central bank and central banks at the heart of these far-reaching developments that are changing the nature of money, the financial system itself, I think this is the perfect stage for Benoit to open a new chapter. So please watch this space. And Lael will very much expand on these themes. What I thought I'd do is just to follow up on Kristen's presentation and discuss some latest developments. Now, what I'd like to do is to begin with emerging markets, but I'd like to move straight on to the advanced economies shortly. This chart in the black line shows the annual appreciation of the broad dollar index. So when that black line is above 0, it represents an appreciation of the broad dollar index over the previous year. The red line, the thick red line, is the percentage growth in dollar-denominated credit to emerging markets, so annual growth. The dotted line is bank flows, and the bold line is total dollar credit. And what you see is this very striking pattern of reflected symmetry, where when the dollar has weakened in the previous year, this coincides with a period of very rapid growth in dollar-denominated credit to the emerging markets. And what's interesting is just to think about the last 3 or 4 years through the lens of this chart. From the beginning of, well, actually, it was in the middle of 2014, the dollar began to appreciate very sharply. You see the black line going up. That coincided with a pullback in dollar credit to emerging markets, culminating in the devaluation of the renminbi in the summer of 2015. Whereas in 2017, it was actually a very good year. If you recall 2017, that was a year when even though the Fed was raising rates, financial conditions were actually very accommodative, and the real economy was also doing very well. Alas, in 2018, the dollar began to strengthen again, and we've seen the latest downturn. Now, why might this be the case? Let me come back to this at the end, but let me just quickly skip to this chart. So one hypothesis, as Hélène in the previous session, and as Kristen mentioned in this session, is that this has something to do with financial intermediation. So if financial intermediaries are more forthcoming during a period when the dollar is weak, you would imagine that balance sheet capacity is more ample. Conversely, when the dollar is stronger, balance sheet capacity shrinks. And the blue line here gives you the CIP deviation. It is the deviation, so it's a difference between the interest rates that are inherent in dollar funding in the money markets versus the interest rate on the dollar that's implicit in the FX swap market. The sign convention is such that when that blue line is negative, it means that dollars are very scarce in the FX swap market. And what we've seen is that even though textbooks say CIP deviations are impossible, you can see that they've been the rule rather than the exception after the crisis. And again, you see this very striking reflected symmetry where a stronger dollar, which is the red, again, the broad dollar index, is associated with tighter financial conditions. Now, if you run a regression where you say, regress the change in the CIP deviation on the broad dollar index, you actually get a sensitivity of how much the CIP deviation of a particular currency vis-a-vis the dollar is as a function of the broad dollar index. And you can actually plot it on this kind of chart where we're measuring the dollar beta. It's the regression coefficient where you're asking how sensitive is the CIP deviation of the euro, let's say, vis-a-vis the dollar, with respect to changes in the broad dollar index. And that's the dollar beta for the euro. And then you say, well, what is the average size of that CIP deviation of the euro? And what you see is that there is a striking positive relationship where it's the currencies whose CIP deviation is most sensitive to changes in the dollar that tend to have the largest deviation. In other words, this is a cross-sectional relationship that's rather like the capital asset pricing model. The dollar, your sensitivity to the dollar is a pricing factor in the asset pricing sense. And notice the really striking thing. The left-hand panel is a 3-month, the right-hand panel is a 5-year basis. Notice the really striking thing here, which is that it is the safe currencies that tend to have the largest deviation. So it's not the Australian dollar or the New Zealand dollar, it's the yen, the Danish kroner, the euro, and the Swiss franc. And one hypothesis here is that the institutional investors from the euro area, from Japan, they have to invest globally, but they have obligations to their policyholders and beneficiaries in their home currency, and they have to avail themselves of the swap market. And so they are in the dollar-denominated securities market, but they would rather not be, and because of this, this is having to go through the banking sector and is showing up in its sensitivity to the dollar itself. So what are some of the implications? Well, the broad dollar index, and as Kristen said, various risk measures such as the VIX index of implied volatility in the stock market have lost some of their explanatory power as compared to the pre-crisis years. And we have to ask ourselves, well, what are the more relevant risk indices? And to some extent, the broad dollar index may actually have a role to play there. Another indicator is that another implication is the implications for monetary policy itself. Now, whereas institutional investors from Japan, the euro area, tend to go for long-term securities, long-term bonds, the hedging takes place normally at much shorter maturities. So they're rolling over maturities at a much shorter much higher frequency. And at a first approximation, the hedging cost is the short-term interest rate. And so when you take that hedge return, the slope of the yield curve itself comes in these hedging decisions and the market dynamics. And in that sense, monetary policy and the relative slopes of the yield curves across the major jurisdictions are going to be very closely related as well. And it would not be an accident, for example, that when the Fed was raising rates in the years running up to the most recent period, and as the yield curve was flattening, we saw a much greater demand for euro area securities because even the long-term rates were low, the short-term rate was even lower, and therefore the slope was higher. We saw a lot of capital inflows into euro-denominated securities. And I think what all this means is that this very sharp distinction between real and financial developments may be harder to draw even than perhaps you had once thought. So, and yes, let me conclude
Perfect.
there.
This is perfect,
Good.
Yoon. Thank you very much. So we've seen the flows, the relativity of the flows, the impact of the dollar on the flows and on the prices, actually. And something is missing in the picture and is going to be brought by Len now. This is the digitalization, and we have suddenly a new dimension of the discussion that is erupting, and how can we analyze this? So Len, I would say, also delivers speeches. And she's actually very good in that. I read a number of speeches with a lot of interest. I recommend especially the last October speech on digital currencies, stable coins, central bank digital currencies, especially fast payment systems, which actually is the focus at the end of the speech. Really very insightful. So thanks for being here, and the floor is yours.
Yes. So I've been working with Benoit now for over, I guess, for a decade, starting at our respective treasuries, where we both were drafted as financial firefighters, and then I followed him into the world of central banking, where we were both working on stabilization, recovery, and normalization in our own jurisdictions. And over that time, I've developed very deep admiration for Benoit's keen insights and outstanding judgment. But just as important, Benoit always has a plan, and it's generally a good plan, and it's generally addressed to the right problem. And he generally gets it executed with exceptional efficacy and strong support, and that, in my opinion, is a rare and invaluable combination in public service. Benoit's success, I think, can be seen actually in the data. Nope. Nope. Hold on. There we go. So his tenure at the ECB was marked by an incredible turnaround in both unemployment and output growth. In fact, at the Fed, we now term that the Curé curve, or la courbe Curé, which is one of the few things that works in both languages. Benoit's research interests are very forward-looking, as others have noted, and extend well beyond the macroeconomy. When he was appointed chair of the CPMI, the Global Standard Setter for Payments Issues, he doubled its output, resulting in nearly 75 reports. So you can add that to the 175 speeches. And he turned its focus to digital currencies well before many other central bankers realized these issues would be transforming our worlds. Indeed, the number of Google searches for central bank digital currencies increased sharply over the course of his tenure. And at the start of his term, Bitcoin's market capitalization was small, and there were only a handful of cryptocurrencies. But in the 8 years since then, you can see that both the market cap and the number of cryptocurrencies is now in the thousands. Indeed, the potential of cryptocurrencies and stablecoins to scale rapidly is illustrated by the accelerating rates of technology adoption and the growth of large networks. And that, I think, is the topic that I was asked to speak about. And we can understand, I think, through looking at some of these trends, why Benoit was asked by G7 leaders to look at the issue of emerging stablecoins. If you look at the adoption rates of new technologies, essentially they compress over time. So what once might have taken 40 to 50 years, landlines to reach 80% of the population later took 15 years. In the case of the internet, this is looking at the US, and most recently smartphones and social media have achieved the same level of adoption in less than a decade. But that rapid adoption is even more evident in the payments landscape, where network externalities are extremely important. Over the course of 5 years, Venmo transactions grew over 66 times. In China, mobile payments grew over 35 times in only 5 years. And in India, over only 3 years, we've seen that kind of payment adoption going to 400 times the pace. In terms of digital currency payments projects from big technology firms that start with network advantages, they have the potential to scale even more rapidly. And because the utility of any medium of exchange increases with the size of the network that uses it, the power of a stablecoin payment system depends on the breadth of its adoption. With nearly 1/3 of the global population as active users, the Libra stablecoin project stands out for the speed with which its network could reach global scale. And that potential is leading central bankers and other authorities to revisit fundamental questions about money and payments. While central bank money and commercial bank money are the foundations of the modern financial system, non-bank private money or assets also facilitate transactions among a network of users. In some cases, those non-bank private assets may have value only within the network, while in other cases, the issuer may promise convertibility to a sovereign currency such that it becomes the liability of the issuing entity. In contrast, stablecoins aspire to achieve the functions of traditional money without relying on confidence in an issuer, such as a central bank, to stand behind the money. And for some potential stablecoins, it appears users may have no rights with respect to the underlying assets or to any issuer. So while we've seen the growth of massive payments networks on existing digital platforms, such as Alipay and WeChat Pay, so far these networks operate within a jurisdiction based on the sovereign currency as the unit of account, and balances are transferred in and out of bank or credit card accounts. We've also seen the issuance of stablecoins on a much smaller scale, such as Gemini or Paxos. What would set the Libra project apart, if it proceeded, is the combination of an active user network of more than a third of the global population with the issuance of a private digital currency opaquely tied to a basket of sovereign currencies. That potential to be adopted globally in a short period and to establish itself as a potentially new unit of account means the stakes are exceptionally high. Libra, and indeed any stablecoin project with global scale and scope, must address a core set of legal and regulatory challenges. Unlike social media platforms or ride-sharing applications, payment systems cannot be designed as they go due to the nexus with consumers' financial security. So to just give you an illustration of what kinds of risks regulators are worried about, cryptocurrencies already pose risks to the financial system. Estimated losses from fraud and thefts associated with cryptocurrencies nearly tripled over the last year alone, and in most cases, customers bear the losses. By contrast, consumers in the US and the Euro area expect strong safeguards on their bank accounts and the associated transactions. Statutory and regulatory protections mean that consumers can reasonably expect their deposits to be insured up to a limit, fraudulent transactions to be the liability of the bank, transfers to be available within specified periods, and clear standardized disclosures of fees and payments. Not only isn't it clear that comparable protections will be in place with Libra or what recourse consumers will have, it's not even clear how much price risk consumers will face since they don't appear to have rights to the stablecoin's underlying assets. Illicit finance is also a significant concern. In one industry report, research found that roughly 2/3 of the 120 most popular cryptocurrency exchanges have weak AML, CTF, and KYC practices. Only about 1/3 of the most popular exchanges require ID verification and proof of address. And that's notable since one study estimated that more than 1/4 of Bitcoin users and roughly half of Bitcoin transactions are associated with illicit activity. So there are also questions related to financial stability. Liquidity, credit, market, or operational risks alone or in combination could trigger a loss of confidence and run-like behavior. Of course, the precise nature of that risk would be driven in part by how the stablecoin is tied to an asset, if at all, and the features of the asset. For instance, a stablecoin tied to one-to-one to an individual sovereign currency would be quite different than one tied to a basket of currencies. A stablecoin built on a permission network, quite different from a permissionless network. And a stablecoin used solely by commercial banks, quite different from one used for general purpose use by consumers. Similarly, there are important implications for monetary authorities, particularly for smaller economies. There may be material effects on monetary policy from private sector digital currencies as well as from foreign central bank digital currencies. In many respects, these are similar to dollarization, aside from the fast pace and wide scope of adoption. So for all these reasons, the emergence of stablecoins is raising important questions for regulators everywhere. In the United States, the regulatory framework is not straightforward. Our current framework is based largely on whether a cryptocurrency is deemed to be a security or has associated derivative financial products, or the participating institutions are themselves supervised. Unlike many other jurisdictions in the euro area, regulators don't have authority over retail payments in the US. Moreover, the regulatory challenges are likely to be inherently cross-border in nature, which is why the G7 took this up. Because stable coins are unlikely to be bound by physical borders, regulatory actions in one jurisdiction are unlikely to be fully effective without coordinated action elsewhere. Of course, the prospect of global stablecoin payment systems has intensified the interest in central bank digital currencies. Proponents argue that central bank digital currencies would be a safer alternative to privately issued stablecoins because they would be a direct liability of the central bank. But a more relevant question may be whether some solutions may be able to offer the safety and benefits of real-time digital payments based on sovereign currencies without necessitating radical transformation of the financial system. In the US, there are important advantages associated with current arrangements. Physical cash in circulation continues to rise due to robust demand for the dollar. And of course, as others have noted, the dollar plays an important role globally. Moreover, we have a robust and diverse banking system that provides important services along with a widely available and expanding variety of digital payment options. Circumstances where the central bank issues digital currency directly to consumer accounts for general purpose use raises profound legal, policy, and operational issues. That said, it's important to study whether we can do more to provide safer, less expensive, faster, or otherwise more efficient payments based on sovereign currency. Some jurisdictions are likely to move in this direction faster than others based on the particular attributes of their payments and currency systems, and so we are actively seeking to collaborate with other jurisdictions as we advance our understanding of the potential benefits and costs. In the US, we're actively working to introduce a fast payment system for the United States. Benoit's been very involved in the one here, to improve the speed and lower the cost of consumer payments. And finally, as we work to reduce frictions, one of the most important use cases is for cross-border payments, which everyone agrees are slow, cumbersome, and opaque. Authorities in many jurisdictions recognize the importance of cooperating across borders with each other and the private sector to address these cross-border frictions. So given the stakes, any global payments network will be expected to meet a high threshold of legal and regulatory safeguards before launching. More broadly, the work ahead is not easy. The policy issues that I've outlined are complex, the coordination challenges are significant, and there are few simple fixes. That is why I'm especially pleased that Benoit will continue to help us navigate these issues as the new head of the BIS Digital Innovation Hub. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lel. I think a lot of food for thought. I already have some questions, but I need some guidance about, because officially we have 3 minutes for the discussion. Okay, so who would like to start? Yes. Here.
Thank you very much for the very comprehensive presentations. Can I ask one question to Christine Forbes? Perhaps one missing explanation on why banking flow stopped. If I can understand from your diagram, this happened around 2010, 2012, so that perhaps was the fear of the breaking of the euro. So perhaps this is the most useful explanation of why this happened. What do you think?
Thank you for this very concise question, and of course the answer is very simple, but please keep it. Can we take a couple of others? Yes, here. Yeah.
Two quick questions, one for Christine and one for Hyun. For Christine, Facebook paid zero taxes in Europe since it was ever created. And typically, the possibility of printing money is called seigniorage or tax, seigniorage. Why should a company that never pay taxes in Europe should be given something that only governments have for free? The second question, Hyun, you mentioned a lot about flows. One of the key reasons in markets we see is that given 100, the currency of the wealth, where people are denominated, so the passport, a third is American and 2/3 is the rest of the world, and the rest of the world does not trust their own currency because they don't trust the government. And so what happens, half keep dollars denominated, so keep assets in dollar denomination. So they might be in any currency, they don't trust their own government, so they basically swap into dollars. Is this the reason why the beta is so much higher? Because fundamentally, the rest of the world does not trust their own government, and that's why they resolve to the dollar. And hopefully they will trust the euro, that will be rebalanced.
Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to ask a question. Coming back after listening to Lael, coming back to the two of you. So we've seen the regulatory challenges with digital currencies. There are different types of digital currencies, of course, but what are the main challenges for capital flows and capital markets? We can think about the market for safe assets, but also the markets in emerging economies. So could you give your insights about this? Okay, so Hyun? Would you like to start, or
yes, I can start. So Davide asked a very good question, which is why so much in dollar assets. I think here it's partly historical, but I think it's very important to recognize how all the pieces fit together and reinforce each other. So on the one hand, dollar is an invoicing currency, but that means that working capital has to be in dollars. But then if you're investing in an oil plant, then of course oil is priced in dollars, therefore you have to borrow in dollars. But that means that there's a lot of dollar debt out there, which means that it ends up on the portfolio of global investors. So it's not US borrowers as such, it's the dollar-denominated security. So it's very it is a reinforcing set of factors. And provided that everyone else is doing it, of course, you would want to do that to reinforce. Let me just add how happy we are to have Benoit at the BIS, because I think it's easy to underestimate how much interest there is out there. And for central banks, let me just reiterate something that I said at the very outset, which is central banks really find themselves at the center of some of the most far-reaching developments in the financial system. It's the nature of money, the nature of the payment system, as Lael was laying out. And I think there is, so this is an opportunity for us to really rethink some of the most fundamental questions. And you will see Benoit very often in Basel when you come to Basel. And I think it's going to be, well, it's certainly a real privilege for us to continue our work in this area. I think the short answer to your question, Agnes, about what are the implications of digitalization for these traditional international finance questions is we have yet to see. But I think that they are probably, the answers probably will surprise us when we finally get there.
Okay. Christine?
So I'll take three questions. So first, the contraction in international bank flows. It just mechanically, a lot of that is Europe, because Europe was where a lot of the boom happened before in cross-border bank flows and where some of the collapse happened. But it wasn't just because of, say, slower growth in Europe or pressure on individual banks in Europe. There's also quite a bit of research that shows that it was tighter regulations in a number of countries which contributed, and also some of the crisis resolution packages. So, for example, there's one study which shows for the UK passed what was called a funding for lending scheme, which basically gave increased incentive to lend domestically instead of internationally. And that led to a meaningful contraction in UK cross-border bank lending, which actually contributed meaningfully to the global contraction in cross-border bank lending, just because the UK is such a big share of cross-border bank lending. So it wasn't just slower growth in Europe. There's a lot of other things going on at the time too, although mechanically Europe is a key part of the story for sure. The question on international taxation, so I think some of that is especially related to the tech companies, is more for Lael than for me. But I will just make a comment that Philip Lane, is in his pre-policy life, wearing his academic hat, did some very nice work showing how these differences in tax rates do matter quite quite a bit for explaining capital flows. He showed how, for example, in Ireland, some of the tech companies' preferences to locate there for tax reasons can explain a big chunk of what we're seeing. So yes, it is very important. Your question, Agnes, on the big challenges for capital flows due to technology and digitalization, a whole host of fascinating issues. But let me just link it back to the one that I spoke about, which was, I think, post-crisis, a number of the reforms we've taken have made a sounder, safer banks at the core of the financial system. That's good. There's some evidence I showed that suggests this has made the global financial system more resilient, maybe somewhat less vulnerable to changes in the global financial cycle, risk measures. They made capital flows more enduring, as Benoit kept focusing on. So that's good news. But new technology and some of these new forms of capital flows, especially if it can happen by pressing a button on a phone, does make me worry that then these risks are shifting more to this sector. So banks are sounder, but now the capital flows are shifting elsewhere. So some of the progress we've made there, we should not rest on our laurels. There's going to be a whole new area we're going to have to shift our attention to.
No? So I think we are going to close this wonderful session. What can I take home? I think it's quite clear for the next 8 years, we need to work very hard on looking at capital flows separately for each type of capital flows, not only growth flows, but also the different types of, and also linking this discussion with the payment systems, because as you say, the distinction is going to be difficult going forward. The asymmetries in the system. The world is not flat, we know that. It's not flat from a geographic point of view, but also with respect to prices. So this is a very important message. And also, it's fascinating how we need today to rethink about what is a currency, what is an international currency, what is the international monetary system. So this is fascinating because we are sometimes reading old stuff to make sure we really understand what these new things are bringing. So it's really stimulating for the research community. So thanks a lot for organizing this wonderful seminar.
So we're coming to the end of this conference, but it's not quite the end yet because we'll have the privilege and pleasure to listen to Jean Tirole at lunch. I still have a few remarks. And before I start my remarks, let me say a quick word of thanks. Actually, 3 words of thanks. The first thank you is to all of you coming today to this conference. It means much to me to see people traveling from far away. Yesterday night I joked from far away, even from France, for today's event. I'm really honored. Second thank you is to the speakers and chairs. That was an incredibly insightful conversation. I was really struck and even shocked by some of the remarks. Helen's remark that the world may be kind of split between the Fed taking care of the global financial cycle, PBOC taking care of the global trade cycle, and what does Europe do? Well, we don't know. That was kind of really capturing a lot of the issues of the day. I would maybe just like to kind of qualify or mitigate some of the suggestions about causalities, like the causalities between my speeches and the tweets of the President of the United States. I think that's really far-fetched. But no, thank you very much for putting together this great discussion. And the third thank you is to those who helped organizing today's event. Organizing such an event, that seems pretty easy when you come and sit and listen. Little bit less easy when you come and sit and speak. But it's a lot of work. It requires lots of help and input by lots of people. And although it's impossible to name everyone, I would like to thank 4 persons in particular, Alessandra De Magistris, Entela Lenia, and my 2 assistants, Lucille Germain-Bonne and Ina Göking, for putting together today's event and making sure that everything runs smooth. So in a few days, I will leave the ECB after 8 years of unprecedented challenges for the integrity and stability of the euro. Throughout these years, the ECB's resolve and steadiness have been the cornerstone of Europe's crisis response and economic recovery. And I feel grateful and humbled to have been given a chance to be part of this effort. I would like to thank former President Mario Draghi. I would like to thank very much my present and former executive board colleagues, and it's really nice to see all of you here, Vita, Peter, Jörg, also, etc., and all the governing council colleagues. And for the president, Christine, it comes at the end, so don't worry about that. It will come. And I would like to thank the staff of this great institution for their friendship and trust. Starting point for my remarks this morning, and you will see that it kind of brings together a lot of things that you've actually heard on the two roundtables. So there are lots of echoes here with what we've heard this morning. But the starting point for my remarks is the sense of frustration and people's sense of criticism of central banks for failing to deliver inflation consistent with our aim. And the criticism of central banks has taken several forms in society. Professional observers, financial market participants often criticize the inadequate size of our action. They question the effectiveness of our instruments. We've heard a little bit of that this morning. Private citizens criticize the type of instruments we use, in particular asset purchases, negative interest rates, which are very much under fire around us as we hear today. And the side effects that they associate with these instruments. The use of these instruments has caused persistent mistrust, while 3 in 4 euro area citizens think the single currency is good for the EU, so 75%. 2 in 3 think it is good for their country. Less than half of citizens trust the ECB. It's not new here, but you see this gap between trust in the currency and trust in the institution. And so in my remarks this morning, I would like to make 2 points that speak to these concerns. The first point is that there is no contradiction between inflation being low and monetary policy being effective. Central banks have achieved great success in recent years. Their achievements, however, and this will be my second point, are of little avail if the public does not recognize or understand them. So it's a lot about the connection to the public. And I will argue that this what I would like to call the veil of effectiveness creates enormous challenges for the credibility and acceptance of central banks, challenges which can only be overcome by revisiting the appropriateness of components which are at the heart of our current monetary policy framework, namely 4 components: how we define price stability, how we measure inflation, how we evaluate the credibility of our intentions, and the range of counterparts through which we implement our monetary policy. So going also into the instruments. So let me start with how to square low inflation with policy effectiveness. And that centers on 2 separate questions. How should we, the central banking community, evaluate the effectiveness of our own actions? And why, despite years of extraordinary policy support, is inflation remaining stubbornly low? And evaluating our own actions is surprisingly difficult. There is no handbook, no checklist that we can use to consistently grade our actions. Ultimately, of course, there can be only one yardstick to measure central bank effectiveness. We know that, and that's our track record in delivering inflation consistent with our aim. But does inflation failing to converge mechanically to our aim imply that our actions have not been effective? And the answer is no. Despite unprecedented challenges to monetary policy implementation, central banks have succeeded in delivering financial and monetary conditions that are exceptionally supportive of real economic activity. Many euro area firms currently borrow in financial markets at negative rates. Bank lending rates, also for small and medium-sized companies, are currently at or close to historical lows, with little dispersion across major economies and across the Eurozone. Firms have responded to these incentives as economic theory would predict. Over the past 5 years, real investment has expanded at a faster pace than in the 5 years preceding the global financial crisis. This is no small achievement considering the persistent uncertainty that has weighed on sentiment in recent years. Investment, in turn, has boosted job creation. Employment is up by 7% compared with mid-14. And in many Eurozone countries, wages are growing at the fastest pace in many years. So all in all, ECB staff estimates show that without our policy actions, Euro area real GDP would have been up to 2.7 percentage points lower at the end of last year, 2.7%. And inflation would have been up to half a percentage point lower every year over the past 4 years, 0.5%. So that's about the counterfactual, right? And as economists, we love counterfactuals. And such counterfactuals, based on a wide range of models, are important proof that monetary policy has been effective along the full chain of transmission, from financial market prices to economic activity, and from the real side to the nominal side. For everything we know about policy, about how policy propagates through the economy, inflation today would be significantly lower in the absence of our actions, and maybe even dangerously close to deflation. But such counterfactuals are far too complex to lend true credibility to our actions outside of our narrow circle, but outside of this room, by and large. They still raise the question as to why policy support has failed to promote a more robust convergence of inflation to levels that would allow normalization of policy, that would allow graduating the instruments that have caused mistrust and concern. And there are two broad hypotheses for why this might be the case. So why inflation has not converged in a more robust way so far. The first range of hypotheses is that policy has been wrongly calibrated. That is, slack is larger than widely assumed. Policy should be even more accommodative, and you find that in the public discussion. And it's true that the output gap is an elusive concept that actually should never have become a gauge for conducting public policy, and it may be larger than thought. And I could expand on using the output gap for fiscal surveillance, but that's not the topic I'm addressing today. And there's a lot to say about that. And broader measures of unemployment that include, for example, involuntary part-time work remain well above headline unemployment. So there is a discussion on the measure of slack, but even these measures are now no longer higher than they were before the crisis. And I would also dismiss the assertion that the relationship between output and inflation has broken down, so the Phillips curve. A plethora of empirical studies prove that the Phillips curve is alive and well. So the second, and in my view, more plausible explanation is that the Phillips curve has shifted inward over time. That is, inflation today may be lower at every level of the output gap, whatever it means. Such shifts typically relate to persistent and slow-moving changes on the supply side of our economies, where monetary policy has less traction. As such, they are difficult to detect. They are even more difficult to prove, in particular when they coincide with weak aggregate demand. But collectively, their impact on wage and price inflation is difficult to dismiss. Just consider the structural changes in global energy markets, where the shale oil revolution has effectively put a ceiling on oil prices by increasing the responsiveness of oil supply to demand shocks. Think of the secular decline in wage bargaining power that contributed to a significant part of recent productivity gains no longer being distributed to labor, with adverse consequences for real disposable income, consumption growth, and ultimately inflation. Or consider the salient impact of digitalization on the pricing power of brick and mortar firms, which may have contributed, at least in part, to the recent decline in the pass-through of higher wage costs to consumer prices. So these are all supply shocks. Add to these shocks the effect of aging, the rise of services, the broader effect of globalization, and it's hard not to conclude that the combination of these shocks is likely to have put a lead on inflation in recent years, and that these shocks are likely to constrain price pressure also in the near future. And none of it is necessarily bad news. Many of these shocks are in fact benign in the sense that they have the potential to ultimately lift productivity and real wages and pave the way for the low-carbon economy. Central banks clearly need to step up their research and modeling capacities to understand their joint impact. But, so that looks all nice and benign. But until this happens, and the pace will depend a lot on our broader economic policy framework, which I'm not discussing this morning, but of course there are many things we can do in Europe to accelerate this transition. Until this happens, central banks are likely to have to navigate in a low growth, low inflation environment with a risk of repeatedly failing to deliver inflation in line with their aim. So what then can we do, or should we do? I shall say actually, what then should you do, can you do, or should you do in this environment? So let me propose 4 elements for future reflection: how we define price stability, how we treat inflation expectations, how we measure inflation, and how we implement monetary policy. And some proposals, as you will see, are more far-reaching than others. But all share one aim: to bring monetary policy closer to the people, to dismantle the veil of effectiveness, which I've mentioned earlier, and to foster acceptance of policies and instruments that too often are used as scapegoats for shortcomings and deficiencies elsewhere in the public policy apparatus. So let me start with price stability. Consider first the ECB's definition of price stability as inflation rates of below but close to 2%, as we all know. A simple answer to the current challenges would be to lower the inflation aim. But if my dissection of the current drivers of inflation is vaguely true, if I'm vaguely on the right side, then it's clear that this strategy would be wrong on many levels to lower the target. It would misjudge the current low inflation episode as permanent and thereby dismiss the lessons of history on the slow pace of diffusion of new technologies. It would create perilous time consistency challenges for central banks when inflation eventually transitions to the new steady state. And it would shift a disproportionate share of the macroeconomic adjustment burden in Europe onto workers, as even more so than today, shocks to Eurozone economies would have to be accommodated by lower nominal wages if we would lower the inflation objective. And that's really not the best way to foster support for Europe and to foster support for Europe's single currency. So what about raising the aim? That, in my view, would be similarly misguided. Why raise an aim that you have failed to achieve in the first place? I will come to this debate with a different angle. If we communicate that we aim to maintain inflation at, say, 1.9%, and that point was raised in the on the first panel, right? So if we communicate that we want inflation to be at, say, 1.9% or 1.95%, or maybe 1.975%, then we shouldn't be surprised if the public expects us to control inflation up to the first decimal point, or even the second. This significantly raises the bar for maintaining the credibility of monetary policy, particularly given how little the public actually knows about inflation and how little the public knows about monetary policy. So we need to dismantle the absurd idea of an omnipotent central bank that can mechanically steer inflation. The ECB should clarify that it aims to deliver inflation of 2% over the medium term. It could communicate a range of inflation outcomes that can be considered acceptable in normal times. And such a tolerance band, which can be more or less precise, so I'm not venturing into practical propositions here, that's not my role, but such a tolerance band should not be an invitation for inaction or for complacency, because of course that's the answer. That's the objection that can be raised. Research shows that central banks have a strong incentive to already respond to inflation deviations within the tolerance zone. So there is a kind of honeymoon effect, if you want to put it that way, rather than waiting until inflation has crossed the edges. So of course, I'm not saying that there should be some kind of a stepwise answer of monetary policy when we cross the limits of the tolerance band. This should be a continuous answer. And there is no convincing evidence that the tolerance band weakens the anchoring role of a midpoint. It rather recognizes a large and inherent uncertainty surrounding price and wage decisions. It conveys this uncertainty to the general public and its elected representatives, and it establishes consistency with the medium-term horizon of the ECB strategy. But for this change to be effective, 2 elements are critical. First, the ECB would need to do more to communicate the midpoint to the broader public. That point also was raised this morning. A recent survey in the US showed that only a quarter of respondent households knew of the Federal Reserve's 2% inflation aim. Only 25% were aware that there was even a 2% objective at the Fed. And second, the ECB would need to establish a clear track record that emphasizes the centrality of the midpoint in the conduct of policy, which of course can only be built over time. The 2% needs to remain the clear nominal anchor for coordinating both expectations and actions. Which naturally leads me to inflation expectations. How is that going to be perceived by the public? So the second element we should review relates to how we should evaluate expected deviations from the midpoint target. Critics would dismiss the idea of tolerance bounds around the inflation aim because they fear that by signaling our comfort with a range of inflation rates below 2%, we would entrench expectations of low inflation and risk downplaying the nominal anchor. And I have two comments in response to these fears. First comment is that we can no longer ignore the fact that medium-term inflation expectations of both professional forecasters and financial market participants have persistently adjusted lower. Adaptive expectations are rational at times of deep structural change. So we're beyond that in a sense already. And my second comment is really more of a question. Which expectations should central banks consider when evaluating risks to the inflation outlook? Neither the academic community nor the central banking community have ever provided an answer to these questions. I see a large gap between the role played by inflation expectations in our profession and the extent of our actual knowledge of how expectations ultimately affect inflation outcomes and which expectations are concerned. Market-based measures are convenient because they are readily available 24/7, real time, but convenience may prove delusive. Household inflation expectations, for example, have been found to be a better proxy of firms' pricing decisions than those of professional forecasters or financial market participants. And that's the Koybon and Gorodichenko paper, which was mentioned earlier. Expectations by households have pointed in a very different direction in recent times, painting a much less dire picture regarding the inflation outlook. According to one survey, households believed that annual Eurozone inflation between 2004 and 2018 was close to, guess number? 9%, when in fact it was 1.6%. So I'm not saying we should take that number, obviously, but I'm just saying that we need to kind of give more thought to understanding a broader range of inflation expectations and not focusing too narrowly on market-based expectations. Next question, does the measure itself, does the consumer price index need to be changed? So that's about the way we measure inflation. The Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices, HICP, has been a tremendous achievement in terms of providing a reliable, timely, comparable measure of consumer inflation across European countries. But whether it adequately captures the cost of living should be subject to regular review. And a well-known discussion is around the cost of housing. The HICP captures only marginally what's actually the largest single lifetime expenditure of households, which is the cost of housing. Housing costs currently enter the HICP mainly through actual rents, with a weight of 6.5%. And the cost of owner-occupied housing are not included, even though more than 65% of households in the Eurozone own their main residence. And again, there is no easy answer. I'm just saying that we should always make sure that we're using the right measure and allowing a wedge to persist between the inflation that households actually perceive and the rate we officially measure and we use to do monetary policy, that can undermine the validity of our actions. Re-evaluating the appropriateness of these three elements, the inflation aim, the role of inflation expectations, inflation measurement, would already go a long way towards revitalizing policy in line with the current challenges. But it may not be enough. In the current environment of persistently low underlying inflation, elevated uncertainty, if that environment were to persist well into the future, and there is a risk it may, then the odds are large that firms and social partners will increasingly start adjusting prices and wages accordingly. And in this case, more forceful policy action would be needed. And then what do we do? One option would be to do more of the same. I have no doubt that the ECB can further ease financing conditions by deploying its current instruments, by drawing from its current toolbox. But one may doubt whether this approach would be more effective in bringing inflation closer to the aim than it has been so far. And one may wonder how far the depth of our shallow capital markets can be sounded, and whether the side effects of our measures would not outweigh the benefits at some point in the future. A second possible and complementary action or option is to coordinate economist policies more closely. So that's the discussion which is all around us on, let's pass the baton to fiscal policy, right? I'm a little bit skeptical about that. The combination of limited fiscal policy space in many Eurozone countries, the political fixation on large fiscal surpluses in other countries, the persistent opposition to a common fiscal capacity in Europe makes this option not very credible, honestly. And coordination with fiscal authorities should not be a fig leaf for central bank inaction or inability to act. And it can easily degenerate into a threat to central bank independence. But central banks have one key strength, and that's their agility. They've always been able to reinvent themselves, to innovate and overcome even severe impediments to monetary policy transmission. And if transmission through financial markets and banks hits a wall, if the third stage of transmission remains anemic, then central banks have the obvious choice of considering whether to broaden the set of counterparties through which they implement monetary policy. And the discussion about digital currency, which you just had on the second panel, is a case in point. At the heart of this discussion is the question of whether central banks should grant the general public direct access to their balance sheets. This question comes with many thorny technological choices and policy challenges, even political challenges, like anonymity is clearly a political discussion. Also policy challenges in regard to financial stability, in regards to the future of credit intermediation, which are now being discussed in the official community. And there is no easy answer. But assuming that these challenges can be overcome, then there are few reasons why central banks within their mandate should not apply the same set of instruments to accounts of private individuals that they currently apply to banks. That is, charge interests on central bank digital money. And by going to the heart of consumer choices, this approach would likely be more effective and faster in stimulating demand and inflation, and it could have less negative side effects. So to put it in more nerdy terms, rather than addressing the symptoms of low inflation, this would amount to precision surgery at the heart of the Euler equation, right? Which we're not doing today. None of this is to say that it's trivial. Ultimately, central banks will need to weigh the costs against the benefits, just like we did for other unconventional measures. What we should avoid, however, is restricting our toolkit for dogmatic reasons or intellectual convenience and giving up on our ability to deliver on our mandate. And if monetary policy remains a conversation between central banks and financial markets, we shouldn't be surprised if people don't trust us. Too many see us as part of a financial system which has failed to deliver growth and fairness, and this also curtails our policy options. So let me conclude. Technological progress will continue to transform monetary policy in the future. To what extent, in what ways, will depend both on the preferences of society and the risks that a very protracted period of low inflation pose to macroeconomic and financial stability. There will be evolutionary changes that will ensure that current and tested policy frameworks remain fit for purpose. These changes may include, as I discussed, progress on how we measure inflation and on the evolving consensus on how we define price stability. And there will be revolutionary changes, similar in scale and scope to the shift from banknotes to bank deposits a few centuries ago, or the recent adoption of negative interest rates. Technology will create new policy choices and options, enabling central banks to continue acting within their mandates. As Mario Draghi said at his last press conference, never give up. So I wish Christine Lagarde and her team the best of luck. I fully trust that she will find the wisdom and courage to act in the face of ever-changing conditions, as the ECB has always done in its history. Thank you very much.